between two organ stops. And you play with a very light technique, as lightly, as close to the keys. There's not a lot of flailing about and dodging and weaving like you'll see on the piano, and not a lot of this kind of stuff with your hand, because it's utterly meaningless, and all it does is get in the way. We have the ability to couple the two keyboards together. And I take this one, there's two knobs here, and I shove it away from me. And now when I play the note, you guys can see this. So what they're seeing is that the upper keys are going down like by magic as I play the lower keys. So it's just the entire upper keyboard moves, it engages over a little pin, and every time I play a lower key, it actually makes the upper key go as well. What do you suppose happens to the touch then?
Harder.
It is harder, because you're working twice as hard. You're moving two strings instead of one. And we go back and forth in this concerto between the bottom manual with both 8-foots coupled, both manuals coupled together, which is as heavy as this gets, to the upper keyboard, which has always got a shallower touch anyway for mechanical reasons. And so we go from heavy to light. And I don't know about Scott, but it always jars me when I first get there and just think, oh yes, because if you're using a lot of fingers, you're going to get a lot of extra notes. So when you get up, you got to be really small when you go up on the upper manual. And we go back and forth between them all over the place in this piece here. Bach wrote this concerto for 2 harpsichords. He wrote a bunch of solo harpsichord concertos, fewer but still a considerable number for 2 harpsichords. He wrote, I think, 2 or 3 for 3 harpsichords, and he wrote 1 for 4 harpsichords, which I played in a couple of years ago with this orchestra down in Worcester. And it was the first and only time I've ever gotten to do that piece. It's a really cool piece. It was a transcription by Bach, an arrangement by Bach of a Vivaldi violin concerto, which you can still hear. But boy, was that a lot of harpsichords. And we spent the hour before the concert. What do you guess we were doing the hour before the concert? Tuning, yeah. We each got our 15 minutes, and we tuned our instrument. And we took it in turns right around. And boy, that was something. We think most of Bach's harpsichord concertos are actually arrangements of his earlier works for solo instruments. For instance, there's a famous one that's that's for violin, except that it's in E major for the violin. It exists as a solo concerto for the harpsichord, again with orchestra in D major. And these, we don't know what the original ones for these were, and there's some thinking that these were originally keyboards, one of the few ones that were originally for keyboard. But we don't know, because most of the originals are lost, and they're only reconstructed. Where do you suppose he was going to do them? Where he wrote all this music? Everything Bach wrote was for a purpose. The exception of this Art of the Fugue and the B minor Mass in its last version. Everything else had a purpose. Bach didn't sit down and say, "Ah, speak to me, muse," and he listened, cocked his head, and then started writing down. Everything was for a gig.
Or I was going to say for his students.
Actually, not in this case. The students would have been for like two-part inventions and stuff like that. He would have used the well-tempered clavier for his students and so forth. But not in this case. This was for performance. But where would he have been performing a concerto with strings?
Church.
Close. Yeah, she says at a party. Not in church, I'm afraid. It wouldn't have been, the harpsichord wasn't used in church. We used the organ in church.
Right, like the parlors.
Yeah, almost. They weren't quite in parlors.
Coronation.
Salon.
I wouldn't expect you to know this. What's that?
Social gatherings.
There were social gatherings at a place where you drank coffee.
Coffee houses.
At a coffee house. This was a big deal. This was a new thing. This was a big thing. This was, you think Starbucks has a lock on it now, but there were a couple of coffee houses in Leipzig where Bach lived, and people would get together and they would do what? They would drink coffee. They would socialize. What they would not do is update their Facebook account. Right? The Wi-Fi was really expensive back in Leipzig in 1730.
They had a shortage.
Yeah, lousy bandwidth. But they did everything else. And there was an organization called the Collegium, term you've heard before, a gathering of musicians, and one of Bach's extra gigs outside of the church, outside of the many things he did when he was in Leipzig, was to run the Collegium. We think that some of this instrumental music was for performance there. That's where it would have been performed. He was in charge of rehearsing the orchestra, and as always, the conductors also were composers. There was never any distinction between a musician and a composer, a performing musician and a composer. So it's funny to think of, but coffee was new then. Remember, where does coffee come? Where do the coffee beans grow? The answer, the easiest, simplest answer is not in Germany. Right? So somewhere far away, and of course they had to be. You're exactly right. South America is also, and coffee is also grown in the East. We see it in the Caribbean, in Costa Rica, and places like that. Places that involved trade, and trade routes were not yet established. It was not a regular thing to send ships back and forth. But it certainly became that. And in the 18th century, they had a reliable source of coffee. It was a stimulant. It was something fun to do. And so if you had the money, you went to a coffee shop, and Bach provided music. And he had these social events at which these things were played. They were not formal concerts like we would do them today. So with that, we want to try the first movement. So we have 3 movements in this concerto, and we will...